Is anyone here a fan of road trips? Love traveling? Yeah? John, one. Okay, a couple. Anyone absolutely not a fan? No? You just stay in Perth the rest of your life, never leave? We've got all we need right here. Anybody a planner when those road trips are coming, these family vacations or whatever it is you're planning months in advance? Yeah, you've got it. Anyone love just waking up and going somewhere, not even planning at all? I feel like people here, the more I've met you, maybe it's not traveling around the world, but it's walking into the woods for miles on end and not knowing where you're going, or just going for a walk or wherever it is. But I feel like some of you here are, in my opinion, crazy enough to just travel without directions, no planning, just go. But I'm a planner. I'm a bit of both. I'm a spontaneous trip goer, but I've got my GPS set up and I'm following it to a T because I need to know where I'm going. When I go on trips, when I go anywhere, I just don't like not knowing what's in front of me, what's coming up. And I even love now with Google Maps, they have these live updates. And so I'll see the red up ahead, and it'll tell me, if you take this path, you can skip that red, and it'll be 5 minutes quicker. And I'm like, yep, get me on it. And for me, traveling back to Ontario is often what I do. And Highway 30, if you've never traveled to Ontario, you don't know the joy that Highway 30 brought to those of us who do. Because for, I think, $2.50, which is what the toll costs, you get to not go into Montreal. And that's a beautiful thing. When you're traveling for 8 or 9 hours like I am when I visit my family. But the thing is, I like to know what's ahead. I don't like going into uncharted territory. And I just can't imagine traveling out into the world like the explorers who first came here and were charting maps. I couldn't imagine being one of those people who just travel into the world and not know what's coming. No map, no directions, no steps to follow. It's just us and the unknown, uncharted, somewhere we've never been before. That just scares me. I don't like it. But I think some of you here might enjoy that, or maybe you just have a very different concept of what directions are. When I was here, I think this is May 27th was my third May 27th spent in Perth, so whatever anniversary that is, my 2 full years here. And so I'm starting my 3rd year, and I was thinking back to my first year here when I was meeting everybody. I came in, and I'd introduce myself. Usually you'd introduce yourself to me. And right away, there was 2 things that I noticed that were very strange about Perth-Andover, that it was not like this at home. And I'm sure for you, this is not strange things, but very strange to me. The first is within 5 minutes of meeting someone, they would say, well, just come over anytime. Supper's at 5, doors open. I don't just show up to me, that's not an invite. That's just crazy. You don't just open your door 5-7 days a week and say, come over for dinner. You say, hey, next Friday, we're having dinner at 6 p.m. Would you like to come over? But not here. You say, hey, supper's on at 6. We might not be home at 6 sometimes, but just wait for us. Door might even be unlocked. Just head on in. Never been to our place, but come on in. I couldn't get over that. But then the next part of the conversation is where I got really confused, because I'd say, well, where do you live? Well, you go about 10 miles down that way. There's a red house. Now, there's about 3 red houses, so you got to remember it's the second of the 3. Of course, there's a 4th one that has a bit of red, but it's also green. You make a right at the rock. You head down about 3 houses. We're the one on the left. You can't miss us. Now, you're talking to me like this all makes sense. And I just remember sitting there thinking, okay, his name's Frank. His name is Frank. His name is Frank. Oh, okay, thanks, Frank. I might do that. Right? I'm trying to learn names. That's step 1. I'm still awful with names. Today, I went to give Alicia a binder that Belva had given me. And as I handed it to her, I said, this is from Belva. I just have these, I call them brain farts. I just lose names. They go like that. And then sometimes they come back. Most times they don't. But the directions thing, I never understood. And even John, when I went to his place, I just kept saying, well, what's your address? Well, no, that won't work. Well, just give me the address and let me decide. It didn't work. So now I kind of get it. Some homes' addresses just don't work. But it was so confusing for me trying to remember all these places and all these places you got. And then everyone kept calling it the Save Easy, and I said, "What's the Save Easy?" They said, "Oh, the grocery store." I said, "Well, that's the Independent." They're like, "No, it's not the Independent. That's the Save Easy." And there's all these things that when you're the new guy in town, you have to learn. You have to get into the community, learn those things. And so now if someone else comes in, I can go, well, it's by the Save Easy. And oh, you don't know the Save Easy. Please, it's the grocery store. And I feel like, more and more I learn, the more I understand the area. And the more I chart the area, the more I learn. And I feel like I'm fitting in more and more the longer I'm here. But that first year, that first month, or that first week in a new place, if any of you have ever moved around, it's a weird time in your life where you're learning these new things and you're in uncharted territory. And for me, the first time really this happened, I grew up in a town. I know I always say I'm from Ottawa, and that is true. I feel like I would say I'm from Ottawa, but I grew up in a town called Shawville. And it was a town that was about 1,600 people. It felt very similar to this. It was a farming community. Not potato farms, though. We were mostly cows. And so we were a farming community, and I lived in the town. And it was very small. Our high school, people came from all over the place to come to high school. And it felt very similar to Perth. And so that's why, when I first came, it didn't take that long to start fitting in because this felt like childhood. But then we moved to Ottawa, and I think I was about 11 or 12 years old. And it was my first time ever in a new city. And I just remember thinking back to that first night. I was in my room, and my parents were putting me to bed, and they were just kind of like, don't worry, maybe someday you'll even like Ottawa. And I was going, I'm never going to like Ottawa. This is the worst place in the world. And they're putting me to sleep. Hey, listen, I fell in love, if you don't know. But I remember thinking, I'll never be a city boy. I'm too afraid to even cross the street. I mean, the fact that there was lights. In our town, this is where maybe we were a little bit fancier city than here. We had one street light. And that was, but then, now to get to school, I was going past about 6 street lights. And I was just like, what is this place? What are all these people? Who are all these people? And it was so scary to be in this new place where I just didn't know anything. I was in a new school. I had to get new friends. Even just a new house. I'd grown up in the same house, never lived anywhere else. And that first night in that new house, I never thought this place would feel like home. But as time goes on, it becomes home. And that school becomes like any other school, and you get new friends. But initially, walking into uncharted territory, it can be pretty rough. It can be tough on us. And maybe, I think for some of you, I know maybe you've been here your whole life, but I know that those of us here who've moved around, and we know that feeling. And so we know what it's like to start over. We know what it's like to find those new friends. We know what it's like to get the lay of the land, figure out the neighborhood, figure out where we shop for clothes, where do we get gas, what's the right gas station to go to, what's the one we avoid. Trying to keep up with what's cool in your town. For me as a youth pastor, I came from a youth group that was obsessed with video games and going to movies, to hear where they're just obsessed with Nerf. I'll never get it. But they love it, so we do it. But the reality is, whenever we go into these uncharted territories, we're afraid. There's fear that's tied to it. There's part of us that are afraid, we're nervous, we maybe are anxious. And despite how difficult it can be, it can sometimes really push us forward. And so taking that step into the unknown can help push us. And so we have to ask the question in our lives, not only just with our jobs or whatever we're doing, but in our relationships with God. Are we willing to go into the uncharted territory when God calls us to it? Whether we've been around church since we were babies, or we're brand new to our faith, we've just recently started coming to church, we've probably all heard people say that God has spoken to them. Or we've heard that God is leading someone somewhere. Or he's calling me to do this, or he's calling me to do that. And so we've all heard this terminology. And for some of us, it just makes no sense because, one, we just think it's weird maybe. No matter how long we're in church, it just doesn't make sense to me that God is speaking or calling. Or secondly, you haven't actually heard so much as a whisper from God in your life. And so you see all these people around you in church who are saying, God's calling me to this, and you just keep saying to God, well, what about me? And when people say God's calling them to do something, I think for me, a long time, I thought that was actually like a physical voice. I heard God's voice actually saying, do this, do that. And so for so long, I felt like God wasn't speaking to me, but when I eventually came to realize, it's more like an instinct. We're not actually hearing a physical voice, but it's an instinct. It's something that we feel in our hearts. And as we pray and seek God for his guidance, he continues to nudge our hearts in the direction that he wants it to go. But at the end of the day, it's up to us as to whether we follow God or not. And so, I'm sure for some of us, we've had times in our life, I know I've had times in my life where I thought, I really hope God doesn't call me right now. I get it. I mean, I'm happy God's calling other people to go to places, but I am comfortable right here. And if God calls us to something unknown, to uncharted territory, we know that that can be scary. And what if he calls me to do something difficult? What if he calls me to move? What if he calls me to change careers? What if he calls me to just do things that I don't want to do because I'm happy the way things are? If he calls us to walk away from something that we really love? Or if he asks us to do something insanely boring, something we think I could never get joy from? Or for most of us at this point in our lives, I think we just like the rhythm that life has right now, and we don't want that to change. I'm not looking for change right now. I don't want to rock the boat. Some of us maybe are perfectionists. You worry that you'll fail at whatever God's calling you to. And if there's one thing that you want to do perfectly, it's follow God, and so you don't want to fail him. And what if he calls you to something that you're not qualified for? What if you make the wrong choice along the way? Or maybe there's some of us that already feel called to something in our own life. We took that step to follow God. Maybe it was at the end of a church service. Maybe it was during a prayer time, during a missions trip, or a conversation with a friend. Maybe it was the quiet in your own room. You felt God calling you, and you took a step in his direction. And regardless of whether you feel that you've heard from God or not, I think the idea of being called by God is pretty incredible. It usually means something exciting is happening. And so what does it look like when God calls us? And how can we find the courage to respond to his leading, even when it's into the unknown, uncharted places in our lives? So thankfully, Scripture gives us a lot of examples of people who heard God's call and responded to it. And one of the first to do that was Abraham. And for the Christian faith, Abraham is considered a pioneer. He's someone who goes into uncharted territories and paves the way for others to follow. Pioneers that I'm sure you've heard of are like Martin Luther King Jr., a preacher who led the way for civil rights in America. Amelia Earhart, the first woman to fly alone across the Atlantic on an airplane. Susan B. Anthony, who laid the groundwork for women's rights to vote. All of these people were pioneers. They were paving the way for the rest of us to follow. And so Abraham is at the top of that list. And when we meet him in Scripture, he's living a pretty comfortable life. He's with his wife Sarah, his extended family. They're in a town called Haran. And then we read what God said to Abraham to get him out of his comfort zone and into uncharted territory. Go from your country, your people and your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and I will make you a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this is in Genesis 12, if you want to look it up. But he's talking to Abraham right now. And he's telling him that I want you to go into uncharted territories. And so there's a lot of things here that God is offering to Abraham. He's offering Abraham, a 75-year-old married man at the time who had no kids. He's letting him know that he's going to make him into a great nation. In other words, God would give Abraham a family tree full of children for generations to come. Which, I don't know if any of you are 75. I'm sure the last thing you're thinking about is starting a family right now. And so at his age, with his background, Abraham didn't seem to be the logical choice for the job. He also promised to bless Abraham and make his name great all over the earth. Basically, he was saying Abraham would become the most well-known person in the world if he followed God's call. And beyond that, God promised to bless Abraham so much that he could then bless other people. And so God was on Abraham's side so much that Abraham's enemies would become God's enemies, which sounds like a great deal, I think. And so all Abraham had to do was agree to leave his home, everything and everyone he'd ever known for 75 years, to go into a land that God would show him. And so in other words, Abraham had to step into uncharted territory to follow a God he barely knew. And so this was a big call on him, because we know that to leave your home, to leave your family, leave everything you know is not something that we often are excited to do. But God calls him to this. And so if it was me, I'm sure there'd be initially thoughts like, I don't know, God, about that. I think things like sounds good to be the most popular person in the world. That's cool. To get a land, nations, that all sounds fun, but I'm pretty comfortable right here. I'm good where I'm at. But as we know, or if you've read the scriptures, you know that Abraham actually followed God's command and he left. He went into uncharted territory. And in that moment, the man who would one day become the pioneer of our faith started our journey with one step. He didn't know how it was going to turn out or what hung in the balance of his decision. He didn't even really know where he was going, but he took that step. And sometimes that's really what faith is all about. It's taking that one small step, even when we don't fully know where or what God is calling us to. Because small steps lead to big places. Small steps lead to big places. Think back on your story and how you ended up here today. As you start to break down your story piece by piece and look back at different sections of your life, you start to see that your life is full of so many single steps. A decision here, a decision there. And all these decisions may have seemed small at the time, but they eventually led to larger decisions and bigger destinations. I mean, in Abraham's story, all he did was follow God's calling and take a step. And then Abraham and Sarah had children. And then eventually, they created the nation of Israel with those children. And Abraham became the father of our faith, just as God promised him. All by taking that first step and saying, okay, God, I'll leave my family. I'll follow you. So Abraham took the step. He chose courage over fear, and he stepped out into the unknown. And those small steps led to some pretty big places. And so that's, if there's one thing I want you to remember as we leave today, is that small steps lead to big places. I think a lot of times it is the easier choice to just stay where we are, stay comfortable, don't rock the boat. But when you do, you risk missing out on big, exciting things that God has for your life. Imagine what taking just one small step would look like for you this week. Maybe some of you haven't sensed God's call on you, and so your step is just to tell God that you're listening and waiting for Him. And then listen. Pray to God to show you the next step. Or maybe you aren't really all that interested in hearing from God about where He's leading you. Maybe for you, your first step is just to be open to listening and thinking about what God has been maybe nudging you towards. And for a lot of us, I think we already know the next step we need to take. And God's been urging you to forgive someone, or to end an unhealthy relationship, to take a break from social media. You don't know how it's going to turn out, but you do know the next step you need to take to get there. And so ask for God's courage in taking that step. Trust that just like in Abraham's story, God is working in and around you as you journey through life one step at a time. And choose to put your fear aside and trust Him, even when He's calling you to uncharted territory. And so as we go home this week, I just encourage you to think about, what's the one thing holding you back from taking the next step that God has for you?